Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight for Genealogy Research Inspires the Unlocked Path. And so the Tewksbury Genealogy Group is open to everyone who's interested in genealogy. This month's featured presentation is with Janis Robinson Daly, who recently published her first historical fiction novel entitled The Unlocked Path. Janis will discuss how the story took hold while researching her own family tree. And from Ancestry.com to the Philadelphia's Women's Medical College to a finished product of a debut novel about a determined young woman who defied the odds and became a doctor back in 1897, come learn about Janis's story and the story behind that story. And this is a great program for anyone who's done genealogical research and has ever considered writing a book, okay? And again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring. So all nearly 50 of us, I think there's 49 of us. So let's get over 50. Let's call someone up and get them on the Zoom. But all 49 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Janis for joining us here tonight. And Janis, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert, for that wonderful introduction. So I am excited to be Zooming in with 47 of you around the country. Is very cool, not just Tewksbury, Mass. So that's great. And I always feel like, maybe the only good thing that's come out of our COVID situation is the adoption and use of Zoom, because it really has opened up the doors and made so many more connections for us. So happy to spend a little time with you this evening. As Robert said, I've got a presentation queued up. It's about 25 minutes, and then we'll be happy to take some questions at the end, either about my research or about the book or any other writing questions as well. But let's kick it off and introduce you to the two portraits on the screen. The first person I'd like you to meet is my grandmother here on showing up on my right, Elizabeth Pierce Elliott Robinson, obviously my paternal grandmother, whom I never met. She died before I was born, but I always felt a kinship to her. And maybe it was because there were mysteries about her that I never knew. And I never took the time to ask my dad before he passed. But she did have this beautiful looking red hair. I think that's where the red hair gene came from. My sons, when they grow a beard, comes in red. And I still have a tint of red, although mine comes from a great salon on Cape Cod now. But that was the first thing that connected me to her, and this portrait that I did have that my dad gave me of her. She also had two older brothers and two sons, and I have two older brothers and two sons. But again, didn't know a lot about her. And it wasn't until my youngest son graduated college that I decided I needed some other way to spend my time. Both of my boys played sports, and I was heavily involved in their sports right through the college level. They played at the college level. And so suddenly I'm finding a little bit more time on my hands, even though I work full time as well. And that mystery about my grandmother finally made me decide, you know what, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do some research into the family tree, and especially my dad's family and my grandmother's family, because I knew a lot about my mom's family. They came from Scotland. I knew my maternal grandmother. Heard all their stories about coming to Boston, moving to Nova Scotia because they hated the city, and then eventually coming back to Boston and Dorchester. My Robinson side, my dad, actually, my father has documents tracing all the way back to Plymouth and the Sergeant William Harlow House down in Plymouth. But it was my grandmother and the Elliots that came from Philadelphia. So that's the first thing that was a mystery, is how did my grandmother get from Philadelphia to Boston? And the only other snippet I knew about her was that her grandfather was a judge. And that's this gentleman here on the left, Judge William Shannon Pierce. And it was by diving in and learning more about him that I got the idea for a book. So let me take you through a little bit more into some of my research. So again, I knew my grandmother came from Philadelphia. She was actually a debutante, so from a fairly well-to-do family, the Elliots, and that her grandfather was a judge. How she got to Boston to meet and then marry my grandfather, Elliot Robinson, who was from the Newton area in 1912. Another mystery. She was almost 32 years old in 1912. That was quite an old maid back then. And then she immediately had two sons, my uncle and my dad. The other picture that I have of her, I actually found in my dad's bureau when I was cleaning out my parents' house after both parents passed. And I had the task, as many of us children do, of cleaning out the family homestead. And I found this picture of his parents in a small box in the top bureau drawer of his chest. And written on the bottom, it said, "Now touring the southern states." So from my grandmother's dress and the hat, the boater hat and everything, I'm assuming that they must have been on their honeymoon. So it must have been 1912. And then the only other thing that I knew about them was they actually separated in around 1919 when my dad was quite young and his brother. Yet, of course, divorce back then was taboo. Your name could be on the front page of the Boston Globe. I found some from some of my research. So she did not divorce my grandfather, but separated from him for almost 20 years, waiting until my father graduated from college in 1936. You know, maybe she was making sure that my grandfather would pay for the education. Of course, as a woman back then, she could lose a lot if they divorced. She didn't have many rights, so she could have even lost custody of her young children. And then, as I said, she did pass in 1957 before I was born. So a lot of mysteries, and I decided I really wanted to try to find out more about her. So many of us interested in genealogy, how fortunate we are that Google exists now as well. So the first and really only return I found on her name was in an article in the Book News Monthly, which was about my grandfather. So my grandfather, Elliot Robinson, was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer, ended up being a secretary to a Massachusetts congressman in Washington, D.C. He was an artist. My brothers and I are very fortunate that we have many of his oil paintings in our homes. And he was a novelist. So there might have been another gene at play that came down from my grandfather. He wrote several books, and mostly in the romance genre, in the 1910s, teens, and early 20s. And it was an article in this magazine about his 1916 release of Man Proposes that my grandmother's name was mentioned. And it might be cut off here, but it did mention that she was from Philadelphia, the daughter of an English banker, Adolphus Elliot, which is kind of boring, but it did mention her grandfather, Judge Pierce. And it had one other piece of information that I had never known, that he was also a famous abolitionist lawyer and judge during the Civil War times. So that little nugget immediately caught my eye. I've always been a history buff, and the Civil War and that period has always interested me as well. And so all of a sudden I have a name and a few pieces of information that makes me decide, you know what, I really can't find much about my grandmother. She never worked outside the home. I don't know what organizations or associations she might have been involved in living in Newton. But learning about this Judge Pierce turned my attention. And so now I start doing a lot more research into him. Again, relying on Google, and as well as eventually taking a trip to Philadelphia. So William Shannon Pierce, I found this portrait online, and it's actually comes from a commissioned portrait that the Philadelphia 1876 Centennial commissioned for famous Americans in Philadelphia. And then it is now owned and archived at the Hollis Law Library in Cambridge. So I was doing my research and came across this portrait not until about 2020, and we all know what happened then. So unfortunately, I was unable to get to the law library and have them pull it out of their archives for me. But I've got a little bit more information on that portrait and a few more slides ahead. But what was I able to learn about William Pierce? So I did learn he was an abolitionist. Of course, Philadelphia had a very strong abolitionist movement, and he was the counsel for nearly every fugitive slave case that came through Philadelphia in the 1850s. So when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, that meant that any runaway slaves coming north and were caught in Philadelphia were tried. And most often they were sent back to their owners in the South. But William Pierce defended many of them and won nearly every case. So he was actually scorned by many in his profession for taking on the defense side of these cases. But it made me start to have, a great sense of pride, actually, that a gentleman like this was in my family history, and that he was doing incredible work. I did visit Philadelphia, and of course, another great place to find family history and information is visiting the cemeteries. They have all the logs of who's buried there, of course, dates, and many of the monuments will have the inscriptions of birth dates and death dates. And when I found the Pierce Monument in Laurel Hill Cemetery, I also found that there were 7 daughters in the family and 1 son who lived to adulthood. But on the monument, there were also 3 infants listed, so who had died in infancy, which was very common, of course, in the 1800s. So a full household of 8 children. God bless George Pierce, who was the 1 son surrounded by those 7 sisters. I also did some reading and found some information and a great observation in one of his obituaries that one of his friends had mentioned, that he would take great delight in discussing various phrases of the Old Testament with which he was very familiar. And actually, right on the gravestone, you can't read it here, but it's a passage from Song of Solomon 2:17, which reads, "Until the day dawns and the shadows flee away." Now, I'm not a Bible student, but that phrase and the meaning behind those words stuck with me. Until the day dawns, a new beginnings, and how do we brush away the shadows of our past? So that stuck with me and actually came into play in some of the themes of my book. But it was a couple of other snippets that really started me getting to think that there was a lot more going on here with this Pierce family in Philadelphia. There was another mention in another obituary of his daughters were women of character and intellectual training. That was not a phrase you heard about women in the 1870s, that they actually were well educated and of high character. So now I've met a man that is involved in the abolitionist movement. He has 7 daughters whom he believes, should be educated as well and shaped with a strong character. And so I did some more research during my trip and visited the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And they did have a folder of documents that I was able to read, including the Pierce coat of arms, which I had never seen. So it was an illustration done. I am also not a Latin student, but I did call my 2 sons who took Latin in high school and asked them to translate for me. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but dicet et facet, which translates to he said and he did. And that, I think, really sums up very nicely William Shannon Pierce. He said all those law cases arguing for the runaway slaves. And he did. And that came into play when I read the final line on famousamericans.net for his entry, which mentioned he took an active part in founding the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. So apparently he was a strong believer in the rights of others, the rights of women to be educated and following their desires, particularly those that wanted to study medicine. And back in 1850, when this Women's Medical College was founded, it was the first in the United States. Soon after, the New England College in Boston opened, which eventually merged with Boston University, and another school in New York. But this was the first one that awarded accredited degrees to women. And that made the difference because, of course, women have always been healers and midwives. But it was the idea of being able to call themselves a doctor and legally practice medicine that was going to make the difference for these women now that a school was opened for them. So I am now completely enamored with this Women's Medical College. I'd never heard of it, never known that there was such a thing, but it was opened in 1850. Moved through 3 different locations in Philadelphia until it was eventually up on Henry Avenue in the northeast section of Philadelphia. And they remained the longest running medical school for women only until the 1970s, when they began to admit a few men. And then they did finally merge with Drexel University School of Medicine, only as recently as 2014. So I am the graduate of Wheaton College in Massachusetts. At the time, it was a women's college. So as soon as I start to learn about this incredible college, and particularly the women who wanted to go to that school, I knew what type of woman that was. And I knew what kind of support that they had from their faculty, from their classmates, from their alumni, those very supportive relationships that formed just like the ones that I had with my classmates and faculty and alumni at Wheaton. So I'm drawn into this story, and I read a lot of historical fiction. It is my favorite genre. And I had never heard of women doctors, at the turn of the century or in the 1800s. Had never read biographies of any, had never seen them mentioned in historical fiction. So now I'm beginning to think, you know what, there could be a book here. And more people may want to learn about those pioneering women that paved the path for women in medicine today. So I dove down into the rabbit hole, as us authors like to think about, and genealogy folks as well. You go down these rabbit holes of research and you find one thing and you go one direction, you find something else that takes you down another tunnel. But it's all fascinating, if you love history. So down the rabbit hole I went. And one of the first returns and first student of the Women's Medical College that I met was actually a woman from India. Anadebai Gopal Joshi was the first woman from India to come to the West to earn a medical degree. And her story is nothing less than amazing. And it was really meeting Anadebai that set me firmly on the decision that I wanted to write about these women. And she was, fairly typical of her time and place in culture in India, belonging to the upper caste, where she had an arranged marriage when she was 9 years old to a man 20 years older than her. When she was 14, she bore a son who died from tuberculosis 10 days after his birth. Another terrible disease that claimed many in the 1800s and before, and into the 1900s until they had treatments and vaccines for it. But it was the loss of that infant when she's barely a child herself, that she took her grief and she turned it into anger. And she turned it into a solution because she really felt that she lacked the care and her son lacked the care from medical practices that weren't available to her. And even more so, the idea of male physicians tending to women. So she researched and she found, with the support of her husband, and she's so fortunate that her husband supported her in this decision and wanted her to follow her desires. And so they found the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania and an advocate to sponsor her for admission. And she entered in 1884. At the time, the school was only a 2-year program. And she graduated in 1886 and returned to India. But another piece of information I found on Anna Dabai that is just so amazing that I was just blown away with the words from a 17-year-old woman from Calcutta writing about her desire to be a doctor. Her application letter and an essay, if you will, is on file at Drexel University that has now all the archives. So universities, of course, are a tremendous source of information for lots of different pieces of research you might be wanting to do on genealogy too. But I'll read in part with part of her letter to you, because again, it was her words that really moved me to start to write this book. The determination which has brought me to your country against the combined opposition of my friends and caste ought to go a long way towards helping me to carry out the purpose for which I came, i.e., is to render to my poor suffering countrywomen the true medical aid they so sadly stand in need of, in which they would rather die than accept at the hands of a male physician. The voice of humanity is with me, and I must not fail. My soul is moved to help the many who cannot help themselves. So again, I'm sure I could not write an eloquent letter like that when I was 17 years old, but I think it speaks to her desires and determination to study medicine, which was reflective of every other woman that wanted to gain admission to medical school, and of course were denied by most of the schools in place in the 1800s that only accepted men. So until the Women's Medical College in New England and New York were founded, they had no place to go. So I've got an idea. I'm going to write a book, and I've got an idea for characters. I'm going to focus on some of those graduates of the school. And I do use Anna Dabai in the story because I needed her to inspire my fictional character. I wanted my main character to be fictional, but a composite character that was made up from a lot of my readings of biographies and diaries and letters and other sources, mostly found at Drexel. And 2 other women that I met along the way are real graduates that are up here in the book. But I needed to pick a time frame of when the book would be set. So I could have started at the beginning, the 1850, when the school started, or I could have chosen late 1800s when Anna Dabai was there. But I went back to what set me on this journey, and that was my family research of wanting to learn more about my grandmother, whom I never knew. So I decided to peg the story's timeline to the timeline of my grandmother's life. Now, again, full disclosure, she did not go to medical school. But then I started to think about the incredible history that she lived through. Coming of age in 1897 as a debutante at the age of 18, being a young woman at the turn of the century, being married in 1912, becoming a mother in 1914, and thinking of all that she saw and witnessed in history and lived through, and how did those events impact her as a young woman? Everything from the suffrage movement, thinking about those 7 aunts that she would have had in Philadelphia, and they were educated women. So I'm guessing that they were probably involved in the suffrage movement. And then, of course, was able to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Certainly, 1912 is the year the Titanic sank. So how did that impact just the everyday person? How did it maybe shake their beliefs that an unsinkable ship like the Titanic could sink and take so many lives with it? What did it look like to be a young mother with 2 children at home during World War I, and your husband's in France? And the Spanish flu that's on your starting many of the attributions I found in research is a lot of the soldiers that came back from France injured, and they were out at Camp Devens, west of Boston, infected with this unknown influenza. So I decided to peg the story to start in 1897, a little bit of a coming of age, and then follow up to 1920 so that I could pull upon that rich history and those events. So I did dedicate the book to my grandmother. And again, because I never knew her full story, and I still don't, but I decided to create one. So another piece of genealogy that came into play that helped me with my book. So the photos I had on the previous screen, I had never seen before, except for the one that I showed you on the title screen. So where did they come from? Family treasures hidden in family attics. Another piece, of course, of genealogy research that's available to us all now is Ancestry.com. And I had not had the Ancestry DNA test, but my brother has, and one of my second cousins. And I knew I had some first cousins out there because my dad's brother had 2 children. But unfortunately, as it can often go in many families, my dad and his brother were estranged. So even though I grew up in Needham and he lived in Newton with his family, we never saw each other. They never spoke. The brothers never spoke. So I never knew my first cousins, the Robinsons. But I knew their names and I knew their dates of birth. My other cousin, Frankie, actually passed when he was in his late 30s. But I knew I had an older cousin and the only other woman in the family, a Carolyn Robinson. And I had always wished that I knew her. She was my only other connection to the Robinson family. Because my brothers were honestly a little useless. I'd asked them and they didn't know anything either about family history. So I always wanted to find Carolyn, but I never knew if she had married, had a different last name, and never could find anything. Until I got an email from my second cousin, Fred, who's had the DNA test done. And apparently when you have the DNA test done, you can disclose if you'd like to have your name put out there with any matches. So he contacts myself and my brother and says, does anyone know who Carolyn Griswold is? Her ancestry DNA has matched our family. And I was like, that must be Carolyn Robinson. So I on to Google again, put in the name Carolyn Griswold, and lo and behold, a woman of the right age shows up living in Rhode Island, and I'm living on Cape Cod. So I was able to find her address. I wrote a letter to her, giving her, full opportunity to contact me if she wanted, and gave her my contact information. Well, she called me the next day after she got the letter. And we still don't know why our dads were estranged, but she very graciously invited my brother and I to come visit her in Rhode Island. And she brought down a box from her attic that had all of those photos of our grandmother, photos of our dads as children, as young men. And she also had a framed portrait of William Pierce, the same one that is at Hollis Library. There must have been a couple of copies made. So she had no children of her own, so she has passed everything on to me. So just another tip is you never know what's hiding in a family attic or basement or back closet or inside a box in a bureau drawer. So if anyone else is tasked with cleaning out family homes, go through everything very carefully because you don't know what you might find. I was very fortunate that I attended a book club, and I do a lot of book club talks as well as library talks, and right in Rhode Island in Carolyn's Town. So I asked the hostess, would you mind if I invited my cousin to come with me? And they graciously did. So she brought with her another box that she found in her attic, which was a set of not encyclopedias, they were called cyclopedias of American biography, and they belonged to our grandfather, Elliot Robinson, from I think this says 1888. So they're just, entries about famous Americans. So of course, I immediately flipped to the volume that has the P's and looked to see if William Pierce is included. And there's his entry, the same exact entry that I had found online, but now I'm seeing it in print in a book over 140 years ago. And it was right there in print. He took an active part in founding the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. So, so validation that all the information that I had seen online is backed up with a print version. So that is most of my genealogy story of how I was inspired by doing just a simple research on a couple of names and what I found and what I dug up and what I learned. And then I've just got a couple of other slides to show you how I then translated some of that information into writing a novel. So yes, I did a lot of reading. I was lucky that there were quite a few books out there, nonfiction books about women in medicine that I was able to get my hands on and take lots of notes and note cards, as well as fiction. Some other books in historical fiction that inspired me or had similar themes that I wanted to bring into my story. One of my favorites is by Anita Diamant, The Red Tent. And even though that one is set in biblical times, it does have that sense of community among women and the support that women provide each other through, trials and triumphs and of everyday life. So I wanted that theme to come into a story about the students and graduates of a women's medical college. Susan Meissner is one of my favorite historical fiction authors who wrote in 2018. And I mentioned the date on purpose because it's all about the Spanish flu in Philadelphia. So she wrote it before we had our own pandemic, but it was great insights into, from her research, what did Philadelphia look like during the Spanish flu? It was the hardest hit city in America. And of course, I had to do some reading of what would be contemporary to what my characters would read. So one of the books that I looked into was Kate Chopin's The Awakening, which was published in 1897. So a very appropriate book that a young woman of 18 would want to read or get her hands on, this scandalous book being talked about, The Awakening, because it's all about the idea of defining a new woman for the new century, an educated woman, a woman awakening her own independent desires and her own sexual desires, which made it the scandalous part. So I read that one, and it's now considered a precursor to modern feminist theory. And then, of course, I had to read a few of my grandfather's books, but, great insights into just dialogue, how people spoke, if that was contemporary for the time. It was a much more formal language back then. So I read a few of his novels. Romance is not my favorite genre, but I soldiered through to get a feel for dialogue and clothing and just relationships and how they were presented back then. And as I mentioned earlier, I was also able to, on my trip to Philadelphia, to visit the Drexel University archives. And they are just, archives are filled with so much information, everything from grade reports and photographs and diaries and letters and correspondence, and even a bone box, which the students of the Women's Medical College were had to rent for their semester and for their year, that had about 15 to 20 bones. And then amongst the 40 students in the class, they were able to complete and build 2 full skeletons. So that was really cool. Looking up expenses, how much it cost to go to medical school around 1900. And I am sorry to say to anybody who might be paying for medical school now, or who has recently finished off paying some bills or helping someone pay those bills, it was only $135 for tuition back in 1900. So I don't think the inflation rate is exactly accurate here, but it was a lot of money back then, of course. And then all those hidden fees that colleges always tack on as well. Everything from being able to use the library cost you 50 cents to access the reading room, or renting your bone box for $5 a year. But at the end of the day, the archivist, Matthew Herbison, who was just wonderful in planning my whole trip for me, brought out one other item. And he brought out the meeting minute books from the early days of the school. So this was from the board of corporators or trustees. And, you know, I have to go back just a moment to that notation that William Pierce was a founder of the Women's Medical College. But I really didn't know what that meant. For all I knew, he could have just been a benefactor. He could have been, you know, a financial benefactor. But when I started to open and flip through the pages of these meeting minute books with my white gloves on for those pages, I saw that the first 6 years entries were all signed by the board secretary, William Shannon Pierce. So now I'm holding in my hands, my white gloved hands, the same books that my great-great-grandfather penned in his hand well over, you know, 130 years ago, 140 years ago. So that was just amazing for me. And then just, you know, some other quick research that I did. I interviewed and spoke with some current women medical students. And then I even followed a Instagram account, #WomenInMedicine, to get a feel for what women were going through today, because I feared, and I've actually proven correct, that some of their same sentiments, some of their same challenges that they're experiencing today in 2019 when I was writing the book would be appropriate and reflective of what women were going back through in 1900. So some of these posts were just amazing for me to capture those sentiments. Maybe she was born with it. Maybe it's hard work, determination, challenging her limits, getting knocked down, getting back up, ignoring her doubters, investing in herself, asking for help, and never giving up. Or this great post by Dr. Samantha Bat-Rowden. It happened. It finally happened. A man talked down to me about my specialist subject. He quoted a paper. I wrote the damn paper. Small victories. So, you know, still battling sexism as they did back in 1900 when only 5% of doctors were women. And just for fun, I'd love to share this one to show that we have made advancements, though. We have made strides. This is just a fun photo of a woman resident who was matched for her residency, and her husband's wearing a t-shirt that says, "I'm the trophy husband." So he's quite proud of her. And today, 51% of our medical students are women. So we have come a long way. So what I want to do now is do a very quick reading to show you how I took some of those pieces from my genealogy research and how they inspired the book, but how I also wove some of those sentiments and ideas into the opening of chapter 6 of the Unlocked Path. So again, my main character is a fictional character, Eliza Edwards. A week later, Eliza again scanned the crowded library shelves. Shoulder to shoulder, the books on each shelf resembled a grade 1 class, the tops of heads forming a ragged line, the insides as unique as each student. There you are, you cursed toe crusher. She pulled the bulging Gray's Anatomy off the shelf and opened it to the frontispiece. Inked on the vellum, Eliza read the dedication. Until the days dawn and the shadows flee away. Song of Solomon 2:17. For the Honorable William S. Pearson, on your retirement from the Board of Trustees, we are forever indebted to you for your commitment to the founding of the Female Medical College. Your vision and support allow us to banish the shadows in the study of medicine and bring forth the light of a woman's intellect, ability, and empathy. Our world will benefit from their bold strides forward. A new day has dawned. God bless you. Dean Edward Fussell, MD, Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, May 20th, 1860. Eliza hadn't considered her grandfather's involvement with the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. None of his 5 daughters had felt the call to medicine. If not Pearson women, who were the bold ones who strode forward, endowed with intellect, ability, and empathy? So, from a single sentence found in an obituary during my genealogy research came the idea for a novel. And I am thrilled. The book came out last August. It's doing very well as far as I can tell, being very well received. Book clubs are loving it. A lot of women's issues, women's health issues discussed, of course, all the history. And I am hoping to connect with more libraries and more book clubs to bring this story forward. And think I'll pop in later with this information that I've got about on my website. I'll throw a link in the chat later on. And also just want to call your attention that I've put together, Women's History Month is in March. And I've put together a curated list of 31 titles that I recommend to read for Women's History Month. Of course, The Unlocked Path is on there as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and check in with Robert to see if any questions came in the chat.
So Janis, it was only up on the screen for a few seconds, but I think we've hosted several of those authors from your 31-day Women's History Month suggestions. Just last month, we hosted the author of The Personal Librarian.
Oh,
so,
Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
fabulous.
Fabulous. Lots of good stuff on there for sure. So folks, if anyone has any questions or comments for Janis, now is the time. Janis, I'll ask one right off the bat. What was the most difficult thing about writing this book?
Sitting down and writing. No, it was more, finding the time. I still work full time, so it was finding the time. And then it was being careful to balance, as a history nerd, all the facts that I had put down on my note cards and everything, and not wanting to throw everything in there because it was going to be fiction. It was going to be historical fiction. I didn't want to write a textbook. I didn't want to write a biography. So, how did I make sure to strike a adequate balance between a fact that I thought was fascinating, but would it add to the story? Would it move the story forward? Or was it just kind of an information dump? So that's always probably the most difficult for a historical fiction writer.
And for any aspiring writers on the line, any aspiring historical fiction writers on the line, do you have any general tips or suggestions on how they should get started and how they can publish a book?
So it's not for the faint of heart. You need to have a thick skin because you have to remember reading is subjective. So anybody who reads your book is going to bring their own personal experiences. and opinions to reading any book. And that includes agents and publishers. So it's not easy. It's a tremendously competitive field. But I would say networking, like anything else in life these days, networking is so important. I was able to find out, to connect with some authors that actually are with my publisher, Black Rose Writing. And so I met them, and they were the ones that finally suggested that I submit to them. They don't require an agent for submissions. And so I was very fortunate that Black Rose picked it up. And but it's a tough road, and it takes a lot of time and energy and persistence, most of all.
And you sort of touched on this briefly with the 31 days, but you yourself, what do you read, and who are your favorite historical fiction authors?
Yeah, so historical fiction is my favorite because there's always so much to learn that we just didn't learn in school. You know, there was just so much time for the set curriculums back when we were in school. And my favorite authors in historical fiction genre, so I mentioned one earlier, Susan Meissner. She actually has one coming out, I think it's this spring. Her newest book is called Only the Beautiful, and explores the eugenics movement, which is a really interesting topic. And then Lisa C., who writes amazing Asian culture stories, mostly about women. She also has a book coming out in June, Lady Tan's Circle of Women. And when I read the blurb, I was like, oh my gosh. And I've been in touch with Lisa. She's come to a couple of my book clubs over Zoom. She's wonderful. But Circle of Women, it's all about a woman doctor in China in, I think, the 1500s. So her blurb and my blurb were very similar. And I can't wait to read that one. And then Kate Quinn, I'm going to meet her on Saturday down here in Florida. She's at a book festival. So she's written The Huntress and Rose Code, and most recently Diamond Eye, about a Ukrainian sniper in World War II, woman sniper. So those are the three that come right to the top of my mind as some of my favorites. And then my writing mentor, who is actually also a Wheaton graduate and somebody that I connected with through our alumni network, Ashley Sweeney. She writes American West, historical fiction, women of the American West.
We hosted Lisa C. over the summer. We partnered with the Burlington Mass Library, and it was a wonderful evening.
She's lovely.
Oh, right. So those are all good recommendations there. So Michelle says, thank you for this presentation. It gave me some great ideas. Denise asks, were you able to find out more about your grandmother's later life that you can share?
So not a lot. Again, my oldest brother's 16 years older than me. So he was, about 10 or 11 when my grandmother passed. So he was the first person I asked, what was she like? His response was, I don't know, she was an old lady. So he was fairly useless. But when I met my cousin, Carolyn, who's 20 years older than me, so she was a teenager when our grandmother passed. And so she did have some fond memories of going to Brigham's in Boston and Newton with grandmother, of her taking her to the ice capades and all. So, again, she did not work outside the home, but she did stand firm of, being separated from my grandfather and not filing for divorce until the college tuition payments were finished, with my dad, the younger one, finishing school. And my grandfather was also an alcoholic. So I think that must have come into play to cause the separation. But so at least I was, and then my cousin had some jewelry, some costume jewelry of my grandmother's, and some little bridge sets and everything, and she passed them all on. So I would, that was just so wonderful for me to meet up with Carolyn.
So folks, we're going to wind down. We got about 5 minutes left. So last call for questions. Karen says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Can you speak a bit more on the dialogue process?
Oh, so writing dialogue is tough. And that's why I did rely a lot on some of those books that were written, contemporary for that time, to look at the style of language for my characters. But the most helpful tip was to read it out loud, to actually, say the words out loud. And did it sound natural? It's amazing how really you don't really say people's names in conversation, but you write it because you're thinking you need to make sure they know who's talking, but you really don't. I'm going to pop just a couple of other things in the chat, if that's okay, Robert.
Yeah, go ahead, Janis.
I have a newsletter. So that's the first link I'm putting in here is if you want to sign up for my newsletter, it comes out monthly. And so the month of March, I'm going to have all those 31 titles featured. So if you'd like to sign up for my newsletter, and I don't share your email with anyone, and I only email once or twice a month. The other thing I'm going to put in is, I know Robert said that the book, The Unlocked Path, is on order, should be into the Tewksbury Library soon. But there's a couple of other copies already in circulation in the Merrimack Valley system, so you can put a hold on it. But it's also available on Amazon, so I'm putting that link in the chat for anyone. It is available as an ebook on Kindle. If anybody has a Kindle Unlimited, it's available that way, paperback, and we have an Audible version as well, if anyone prefers audio books. So certainly love to have you check that out.
Do you read the book, Janis, or did you find a professional narrator?
No, I didn't even know it was being produced. It's a professional narrator, and I think she does a wonderful job because I have female and male characters. And it wasn't until I listened to it that I was like, oh, wow, this was challenging. I have children's voices. I have characters with an Irish, an Italian, an Indian, and Russian accents are all in the book. So she's one narrator, Patricia Shade, and she does a wonderful job. Let me also just let you all know that I am actively meeting with book clubs in person as well as over Zoom. And there's a section on my website as well, if you're interested in me coming or joining you for a book club discussion. You can certainly find more information on my website about that as well.
Great. Let's wrap up with Nadine's question. It's a good closing question. She says, thank you, Janis. I'm curious to know what you have planned for yourself next. So Janis, what's next for you?
So one of the best pieces of advice during my writing process was going to a conference, and conferences are fabulous. And there were a couple of editors and agents there, and we were just there, talking about our books. Not quite ready for publication, but we were getting ready. And my original manuscript followed the entire a 50-year span for Eliza, following my grandmother's lifespan. And the first thing that an editor told me was, that's too long of a time period for a first-time author. Your book either needs to be 900 pages, do it justice to that amount of history, and no one's going to spend their time or money to buy a 900-page book from an unknown author. So cut your book off at a logical spot and set your readers up for a sequel. So that's what I'm working on right now. The book, The Unlocked Path, ends in 1920, just as Eliza's getting started. And then the sequel, which I'm working on now, I was on chapter 3 last night, is going to take us into the Depression and into World War II. And what does World War II look like on the home front? Because there's been a lot written about World War II in Europe, but what did it look like over here? And particularly for a woman whose sons, like my dad and uncle, who were of service age and who served.
So folks, let's give Janis a big virtual round of applause. Wonderful job, Janis. And Janis, any last words for the audience? I know you plugged the book, you plugged the website, you plugged the newsletter, you checked all those boxes. Anything else you want to share with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just, and I always say this to anybody interested in genealogy. Look, you don't have to write a book, but ask the questions, especially when the generations are coming together over Zoom or in person, but ask the questions. I never asked the questions of my dad. I never asked him about his mom. And my dad passed when I was 29, so I was fairly young myself. So ask those questions and learn. You never know what you might find. And, some of it may not always be good. And you may not be proud of some of those ancestors in your past, but they can be fascinating. And you never know what's, in the back of the closet too. So be very careful. Don't just toss things in the trash. Open up those boxes, empty them out, look through every page. Yeah.
Good advice, Janis. So thank you so much, Janis. Folks who are watching live, look for an email for me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some of our other upcoming virtual genealogy programs, including Michael Brophy for his Irish Genealogy 201 program. That's going to be in 3 weeks on Monday, March 6th at 7 o'clock via Zoom. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Janis.
Take care. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.